Major Sarah Reaper Chen gripped the control stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt II as she descended through the morning clouds above the Corvanian mountain range. The alien landscape stretched below her like a twisted nightmare of crystalline peaks and electromagnetic storms that had claimed 3 previous reconnaissance missions. Her targeting computer flickered and died as another wave of interference washed over the aircraft. Control, this is Reaper 17. I'm experiencing heavy EM interference. Instruments are going dark, she reported into her comm system, though static was already creeping into the transmission. The response came back fragmented. Reaper, negative on altitude. Pull back to... Sarah switched off the failing radio and focused on the mission. Intelligence needed photos of the Corvanian military buildup in the valley below, and she was the only pilot crazy enough to volunteer for a mission the SEALs had deemed impossible. They'd told her no aircraft could fly low enough through the electromagnetic maze to get clear visual confirmation while surviving the return trip. The Corvanians had been pushing against human colony borders for months, testing defenses and probing for weaknesses. Their technology created natural interference fields that made traditional high-altitude reconnaissance useless. Satellites couldn't penetrate the atmospheric distortion, and previous drone missions had simply vanished into the electromagnetic soup. Sarah banked hard left as a massive crystal formation loomed out of the mist, its surface crackling with blue energy that made her teeth ache. The A-10's titanium bathtub around the cockpit was built to withstand heavy ground fire, but she wasn't sure how it would handle whatever exotic radiation these crystals were pumping out. Her altimeter showed 800 feet and dropping. The mission briefing had been clear about one thing. To get usable intelligence, she'd need to fly lower than any human pilot had ever flown in hostile territory. The canyon system ahead twisted like a serpent through the mountains, its walls lined with the same energy-producing crystals that were slowly cooking her electronics. Sarah's father had been a Navy pilot who died testing experimental aircraft beyond their design limits. Her mother always said she'd inherited his reckless streak, but Sarah preferred to think of it as inherited excellence. Humans didn't back down from impossible challenges. They redefined what was possible. The first canyon wall flashed past her wingtip, close enough to see individual crystal formations. Her backup instruments showed 300 feet of altitude, but the canyon floor was rising fast. She'd have to drop even lower to follow the winding path that intelligence believed led to the Corvanian staging area. A new sound joined the rumble of her engines. Something was following her. Sarah risked a glance in her mirrors and saw 3 sleek Corvanian interceptors dropping through the clouds behind her. Their ships looked like metallic teardrops with energy fields shimmering around their hulls. They were built for speed and maneuverability in normal space, but Sarah was betting they'd never tried to fly a ground-hugging course through an electromagnetic maze. The lead interceptor fired a bolt of purple energy that sizzled past her canopy and struck the canyon wall. Where it hit, the crystal formations exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. Sarah pushed her throttles forward and dove deeper into the canyon system. 200 feet, 150. The canyon walls were so close now she could see the individual striations in the rock between the crystal clusters. Her engines roared as she pushed the Thunderbolt to its limits, the aircraft bucking and fighting against the electromagnetic turbulence like a wild horse. Behind her, the first Corvanian interceptor tried to follow her descent. Sarah watched in her mirror as the sleek craft attempted to navigate the tight turns and dropping altitude. The alien pilot was skilled, but their ship wasn't designed for this kind of flying. The interceptor clipped a crystal formation and went into an uncontrolled spin, disappearing behind a bend in the canyon. The remaining 2 interceptors pulled up, apparently unwilling to risk the same fate. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. The SEALs had been wrong about one thing. It wasn't that no one could fly this low through the interference. It was that no one else was crazy enough to try. Her targeting camera was still functional despite the electromagnetic interference. Sarah activated the recording system and began documenting everything she could see as the canyon opened into a wider valley ahead. What she found there would change everything humanity thought they knew about the Corvanian threat. The valley floor was covered with structures that defied conventional understanding of military engineering. Massive geometric shapes rose from the ground like metallic flowers, each one pulsing with the same energy that flowed through the crystal formations. But these weren't just buildings or weapon emplacements. They were something far more dangerous. Sarah's hands tightened on the controls as she realized what she was looking at. The Corvanians weren't just building a staging area for military operations. They were constructing something that would make human resistance impossible if it was allowed to reach completion. Major Sarah Reaper Chen gripped the control stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt II as she descended through the morning clouds above the Corvanian mountain range. The alien landscape stretched below her like a twisted nightmare of crystalline peaks and electromagnetic storms that had claimed 3 previous reconnaissance missions. Her targeting computer flickered and died as another wave of interference washed over the aircraft. Control, this is Reaper 17. I'm experiencing heavy EM interference. Instruments are going dark, she reported into her comm system, though static was already creeping into the transmission. The response came back fragmented. Reaper. Negative on altitude. Pull back to... Sarah switched off the failing radio and focused on the mission. Intelligence needed photos of the Corvanian military buildup in the valley below, and she was the only pilot crazy enough to volunteer for a mission the SEALs had deemed impossible. They told her no aircraft could fly low enough through the electromagnetic maze to get clear visual confirmation while surviving the return trip. The Corvanians had been pushing against human colony borders for months, testing defenses and probing for weaknesses. Their technology created natural interference fields that made traditional high-altitude reconnaissance useless. Satellites couldn't penetrate the atmospheric distortion, and previous drone missions had simply vanished into the electromagnetic soup. Sarah banked hard left as a massive crystal formation loomed out of the mist, its surface crackling with blue energy that made her teeth ache. The A-10's titanium bathtub around the cockpit was built to withstand heavy ground fire, but she wasn't sure how it would handle whatever exotic radiation these crystals were pumping out. Her altimeter showed 800 feet and dropping. The mission briefing had been clear about one thing. To get usable intelligence, she'd need to fly lower than any human pilot had ever flown in hostile territory. The canyon system ahead twisted like a serpent through the mountains, its walls lined with the same energy-producing crystals that were slowly cooking her electronics. Sarah's father had been a Navy pilot who died testing experimental aircraft beyond their design limits. Her mother always said she'd inherited his reckless streak, but Sarah preferred to think of it as inherited excellence. Humans didn't back down from impossible challenges. They redefined what was possible. The first canyon wall flashed past her wingtip, close enough to see individual crystal formations. Her backup instruments showed 300 feet of altitude, but the canyon floor was rising fast. She'd have to drop even lower to follow the winding path that intelligence believed led to the Corvanian staging area. A new sound joined the rumble of her engines. Something was following her. Sarah risked a glance in her mirrors and saw 3 sleek Corvanian interceptors dropping through the clouds behind her. Their ships looked like metallic teardrops with energy fields shimmering around their hulls. They were built for speed and maneuverability in normal space, but Sarah was betting they'd never tried to fly a ground-hugging course through an electromagnetic maze. The lead interceptor fired a bolt of purple energy that sizzled past her canopy and struck the canyon wall. Where it hit, the crystal formations exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. Sarah pushed her throttles forward and dove deeper into the canyon system. 200 feet, 150. The canyon walls were so close now she could see the individual striations in the rock between the crystal clusters. Her engines roared as she pushed the Thunderbolt to its limits, the aircraft bucking and fighting against the electromagnetic turbulence like a wild horse. Behind her, the first Corvanian interceptor tried to follow her descent. Sarah watched in her mirror as the sleek craft attempted to navigate the tight turns and dropping altitude. The alien pilot was skilled, but their ship wasn't designed for this kind of flying. The interceptor clipped a crystal formation and went into an uncontrolled spin, disappearing behind a bend in the canyon. The remaining 2 interceptors pulled up, apparently unwilling to risk the same fate. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. The SEALs had been wrong about one thing. It wasn't that no one could fly this low through the interference. It was that no one else was crazy enough to try. Her targeting camera was still functional despite the electromagnetic interference. Sarah activated the recording system and began documenting everything she could see as the canyon opened into a wider valley ahead. What she found there would change everything humanity thought they knew about the Corvanian threat. The valley floor was covered with structures that defied conventional understanding of military engineering. Massive geometric shapes rose from the ground like metallic flowers, each one pulsing with the same energy that flowed through the crystal formations. But these weren't just buildings or weapon emplacements. They were something far more dangerous. Sarah's hands tightened on the condor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she processed what lay spread across the valley floor below. The geometric structures weren't random military installations. They formed a perfect pattern, each building positioned with mathematical precision around a central hub that pulsed with energy so intense it made her instruments scream warnings. The central structure was unlike anything in human military databases. It rose from the valley floor like a twisted spire of living metal, its surface rippling with waves of electromagnetic energy that seemed to bend space around it. Smaller buildings radiated outward in concentric circles, each one connected to the next by streams of visible energy that arced through the air like controlled lightning. Sarah banked her A-10 around the valley's perimeter, staying low between the canyon walls while her camera system recorded everything. She could see Corvanian personnel moving between the structures, but they weren't wearing the standard combat armor she'd expected. Instead, they wore flowing robes that seemed to channel the same energy flowing through their installations. A proximity alarm shrieked in her cockpit. 3 more interceptors had appeared from hidden positions within the valley itself, rising from concealed bays in the canyon walls. These ships were different from the ones that had pursued her earlier. Where the first interceptors had been sleek and fast, these craft were heavily armored and bristling with weapons that crackled with the same purple energy she'd seen before. The lead interceptor opened fire immediately, energy bolts stitched across the canyon wall just meters from Sarah's aircraft, turning crystal formations into clouds of superheated plasma. She yanked her stick hard right and dove toward the valley floor, using the terrain to break the alien pilot's firing solutions. At 50 feet above the ground, Sarah's A-10 screamed across the valley floor between the Corvanian structures. Alien personnel scattered as her engines roared overhead, their robes billowing in the jet wash. She could see their faces now, and what she saw made her blood run cold. They weren't just aliens. They were humans. Captured colonists who'd been missing for months, their eyes now glowing with the same energy that powered the Corvanian installations. They moved with unnatural coordination, like individual parts of a single organism rather than independent beings. Sarah's tactical mind processed the implications immediately. This wasn't just a military staging area. It was a conversion facility. The Corvanians were turning human prisoners into something else, creating an army of enslaved minds to use against their own species. The interceptors behind her fired again, but this time, Sarah was ready. She pulled her aircraft into a sharp climb, using the central spire as cover while she gained altitude. The massive structure's energy field interfered with the aliens' targeting systems, causing their shots to go wide and strike their own installations. One energy bolt struck a secondary building, causing a chain reaction of explosions that rippled outward through the connected structures. Sarah watched in fascination as the entire grid of installations flickered and dimmed, the flowing energy streams stuttering like a damaged circuit. The Corvanian system had a weakness. The structures were so interconnected that damage to one could cascade through the entire network. But exploiting that weakness would require a precision strike that no conventional weapon could achieve. It would need someone willing to fly directly into the heart of the installation and deliver a payload with surgical accuracy. Sarah's mission had been reconnaissance, but the intelligence she'd gathered changed everything. If the Corvanians completed their conversion facility, they'd have an unlimited supply of human soldiers who knew every detail of colonial defenses. The war would be over before it truly began. She needed to get this information back to command, but the interceptors weren't giving her any room to escape. They'd learned from their earlier losses and were working together now, trying to box her into the valley where their superior numbers would count. Sarah dropped her aircraft back to ground level and accelerated toward the far end of the valley. Her fuel gauges showed she was running dangerously low, and her instruments were failing faster as the electromagnetic interference intensified. She had maybe 10 minutes of flight time left before she'd be forced downhills as she realized what she was looking at. The Corvanians weren't just building a staging area for military operations. They were constructing something that would make human resistance impossible if it was allowed to reach completion. Sarah's A-10 burst from the narrow canyon exit like a bullet from a barrel, her engine screaming as she climbed into the open sky. The two remaining interceptors were waiting, positioned to catch her in a crossfire that would end her mission permanently. But Sarah had spent the last 5 minutes in the canyon plotting a course that would use their own tactics against them. Instead of climbing to escape, she rolled her aircraft inverted and dove back toward the mountain peaks. The interceptors followed, their energy weapons charging for what they assumed would be an easy kill. They were faster than her A-10, but speed meant nothing if you couldn't hit your target. Sarah threaded her aircraft between two crystal spires that rose from the mountainside like natural lightning rods. The electromagnetic field between them was so intense that her backup instruments exploded in showers of sparks. But the field also created a dead zone where the Corvanian targeting systems couldn't lock onto her aircraft. The first interceptor fired blind, its energy bolts going wide and striking the crystal formations. The resulting explosion sent a cascade of debris across the mountainside, forcing the second interceptor to break off its attack run to avoid the falling rocks. Sarah used the distraction to angle toward a gap in the mountain range that led back toward human territory. Her fuel reserves were critically low, and her aircraft was operating on backup systems that were failing one by one. But she had the intelligence that could change the course of the war, and she'd fly this bird until the engines died before she'd let that information fall into enemy hands. The interceptors regrouped and came after her again, but now they were flying over terrain that favored defensive flying over offensive maneuvers. Sarah skimmed the mountainside at an altitude that would have terrified most pilots, using every ridge and valley to break up the aliens' attack patterns. Her tactical computer was dead, but years of combat experience had taught her to read the battlefield with her own eyes. The interceptors were getting frustrated, taking longer shots that wasted energy and revealed their positions. They were making mistakes, and Sarah was ready to capitalize on them. A proximity alarm that shouldn't have been working suddenly screamed to life. Sarah looked up to see a massive Corvanian heavy cruiser dropping through the clouds above her. The ship was the size of a city block, its hull bristling with weapons that could turn her A-10 into vapor with a single shot. But the cruiser's massive size was also its weakness. In the confined space between the mountains, it couldn't maneuver effectively or bring its main guns to bear without risking damage to the peaks around it. The ship's captain was forced to rely on the interceptors to finish the job. Sarah saw her chance. The heavy cruiser was directly above a narrow valley, filled with the same crystal formations that had been interfering with her electronics. If she could lure the ship into that valley, the electromagnetic interference might level the playing field. She dove toward the valley floor, her engines straining as she pushed the A-10 beyond its safe operating limits. The interceptors followed, and behind them came the heavy cruiser, its captain apparently deciding that capturing the human pilot was worth the risk of close-quarters maneuvering. The valley walls closed around them like the jaws of a trap. Sarah could feel the electromagnetic interference intensifying, but her aircraft had been designed to operate in hostile environments. The Corvanian ships, built for space combat and planetary bombardment, were struggling with the chaotic energy fields. One interceptor lost control completely, its pilot apparently overwhelmed by instrument failures caused by the electromagnetic storm. The craft slammed into the valley wall and exploded, taking a section of crystal formations with it. The resulting chain reaction sent waves of energy racing up and down the valley. The heavy cruiser's main guns fired once, a massive energy beam that turned the entire mountainside into molten slag. But the shot went wide as the ship's targeting systems failed, and the recoil from the weapon sent the massive vessel into an uncontrolled drift toward the opposite valley wall. Sarah watched in amazement as the Corvanian captain fought to regain control of his ship. The aliens' technology was more advanced than anything humans possessed, but it had been designed for fighting in the sterile environment of space. In the chaotic electromagnetic maze of the crystal valleys, human engineering's emphasis on ruggedness and adaptability was proving superior. The remaining interceptor made one last, desperate attack run, diving toward Sarah's aircraft with all weapons firing. But the pilot had forgotten about the valley's electromagnetic effects on his own systems. His energy weapons overloaded and exploded, tearing his ship apart from the inside out. Sarah climbed out of the valley as the heavy cruiser finally regained control and began a ponderous retreat toward space. She'd survived an encounter with odds that should have been impossible to overcome, but the real test was still ahead of her. Her fuel gauges showed empty, and her engines were running on fumes. The nearest human outpost was still 50 kilometers away across mountainous terrain that would challenge a fully fueled aircraft. Sarah would have to nurse her dying A-10 across that distance while maintaining enough altitude to clear the peaks. But as she looked back at the valley where the Corvanian conversion facility was hidden, Sarah knew she'd gladly crash in these mountains if it meant getting the intelligence home. Humanity needed to know what they were facing, and she was the only person who could tell them. Sarah's engines coughed and sputtered as she coaxed the last drops of fuel through the A-10 systems. The massive Thunderbolt was built to take punishment and keep flying, but even the toughest aircraft had limits. Her fuel gauges had been reading empty for the last 10 minutes, and she was flying on whatever vapors remained in the fuel lines. The mountain peaks ahead rose like jagged teeth against the alien sky. Each ridge represented another challenge for her dying aircraft, another obstacle that might prove impossible to clear. But Sarah had grown up in mountains like these, learning to fly in conditions that would ground most pilots. She knew how to read the air currents and thermal updrafts that could give her precious extra altitude. Her radio crackled to life as she cleared the electromagnetic interference of the crystal valleys. The signal was weak and distorted, but she could make out the voice of Colonel Martinez from Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Any station? Any station. This is Phoenix Control. We have multiple Corvanian contacts approaching the outer perimeter. All aircraft return to base immediately. Sarah keyed her microphone with hands that were steady despite everything she'd been through. Phoenix Control, this is Reaper 17. I'm inbound with critical intelligence, but I'm running on fumes. Request emergency landing clearance. The response came back immediately, relief evident in the controller's voice. Reaper 17, we thought you were down. What's your status and position? 40 kilometers southeast of base, flying on attitude and prayers. I've got intel on a Corvanian facility that changes everything. They're not just building weapons, they're converting human prisoners. Static filled the channel for several seconds before Colonel Martinez's voice came through. Reaper, say again your last transmission. Colonel, the Corvanians have a conversion facility in the Crystal Valleys. They're turning our people into soldiers who will fight against us. I've got it all on camera. But we need to act fast before they complete the process. Sarah crested another ridge and saw the lights of Forward Operating Base Phoenix in the distance. The base was built into a natural crater that provided protection from orbital bombardment, its runways carved directly into the rock. It looked like home, but it was still 30 kilometers away, and her engines were making sounds that no pilot ever wanted to hear. The first engine died as she descended toward the next valley. The A-10 was designed to fly on one engine, but with her fuel situation and the terrain ahead, she'd need both engines to make it home. Sarah worked the restart procedures with practiced efficiency, but the engine remained dead. Behind her, new contacts appeared on what remained of her radar system. More Corvanian interceptors were lifting off from hidden bases in the mountains, converging on her position. They'd apparently called for reinforcements after the disaster at the conversion facility. Sarah pushed her remaining engine to maximum power, trading her last reserves of fuel for speed. The A-10 accelerated toward the mountains ahead, but the interceptors were gaining fast. She could see their energy weapons charging, purple light building along their wings as they prepared to fire. The mountain pass ahead was barely wide enough for her aircraft, a natural corridor carved by ancient glaciers through the solid rock. Flying through it would require perfect timing and absolute precision, especially with hostiles on her tail. But it was her only chance to reach the base before the interceptors caught her. Sarah rolled her aircraft into the pass, just as the lead interceptor fired. Energy bolts streaked past her canopy and struck the mountain walls, sending avalanches of rock cascading into the narrow corridor. She flew through the falling debris like it was a deadly snowstorm, her aircraft bucking and shaking as stones bounced off the armored cockpit. The interceptors tried to follow, but the falling rocks forced them to climb and lose the pursuit angle. Sarah burst from the far end of the pass with clear sky ahead and the base runway visible in the distance. But her remaining engine was overheating from the sustained maximum power, and she could see warning lights flashing across her instrument panel. Colonel Martinez's voice crackled through her headset. Reaper 17, we have you on approach. Emergency crews are standing by. What's your fuel status? Fuel status is non-existent, Colonel. I'm dead sticking this bird in whether the engine quits or not. Just make sure someone's ready to download my camera footage the second I touch down. The runway lights of Forward Operating Base Phoenix grew larger as Sarah lined up for her approach. Her engine was running rough now, missing and surging as the fuel system finally gave up its fight. She had one chance to get this landing right, because there wouldn't be power for a go-around. Behind her, the Corvanian interceptors had cleared the mountain pass and were accelerating toward the base. Their energy weapons were charging again, and Sarah realized they were planning to destroy her aircraft on the runway, rather than let the intelligence reach human command. Sarah's engine died completely, just as she crossed the runway threshold. The A-10 dropped like a stone, its massive weight pulling it toward the ground faster than she could control. She pulled back on the stick with all her strength, trading the last of her airspeed for a few more seconds of gliding flight. The aircraft touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the runway with a grinding roar of protesting metal. Sarah fought to keep the aircraft straight as it rolled down the center line, her speed bleeding off rapidly without engine power to maintain momentum. Emergency vehicles raced alongside her aircraft as it finally came to a stop just short of the runway's end. Sarah popped her canopy and climbed out onto the wing, her legs shaking from the adrenaline and exhaustion of the longest flight of her career. But there was no time to celebrate her survival. The Corvanian interceptors were diving toward the base, their weapons fully charged and ready to eliminate the intelligence that could change the course of the war. The base's defensive systems came alive as the Corvanian interceptors screamed toward the runway. Missile batteries that had been hidden in the crater walls emerged from concealed positions, their targeting radars locking onto the incoming threats. Sarah dove off her aircraft's wing as the first energy bolt struck the runway, where her A-10 had been rolling just seconds before. Colonel Martinez was running toward her position, flanked by a squad of technicians carrying portable data extraction equipment. The camera system in Sarah's aircraft contained the most important intelligence gathered since the war began, and every second counted in getting that information to the analysts who could act on it. "Major Chen, are you injured?" Martinez shouted over the sound of defensive fire and exploding energy weapons. "I'm fine, Colonel, but we need to get that camera data downloaded before those interceptors circle back," Sarah replied, pulling herself upright despite the exhaustion that threatened to buckle her knees. The technicians swarmed over her aircraft, connecting cables to the camera system while defensive missiles streaked overhead toward the attacking aliens. 2 interceptors broke off their attack run as human missiles found their targets, but the third continued its dive toward the grounded A-10. Sarah watched the approaching alien fighter with the calm detachment that came from having survived too many impossible situations. The interceptor's pilot was committed to his attack run, betting everything on destroying the intelligence before it could be extracted. It was exactly the kind of desperate courage that humans had been demonstrating throughout the war, except this time it was an alien showing that determination. The base's point defense systems opened fire, filling the air around the diving interceptor with explosive shells and energy bursts. The alien pilot held his course through the defensive fire, his aircraft taking hit after hit but continuing its descent toward the runway. "Download complete," one of the technicians shouted, yanking his cables free from Sarah's aircraft and sprinting toward the command bunker with a data storage device clutched in his hands. The interceptor's final energy blast struck Sarah's A-10 just as the technician cleared the blast radius. The faithful aircraft that had carried her through the impossible mission disappeared in a ball of purple fire, its titanium bathtub finally meeting destruction it couldn't withstand, but the intelligence was safe. Sarah watched the technician disappear into the command bunker as the damaged interceptor struggled to climb away from the base. The alien pilot had fought bravely, but he'd been a few seconds too late. Colonel Martinez grabbed Sarah's arm and guided her toward the bunker as the remaining interceptors regrouped for another attack. "Major, I need you to brief the intelligence staff immediately. What you found out there could change our entire strategic approach." Inside the command bunker, banks of monitors displayed tactical information from across the human colonial territories. Sarah could see indicators showing Corvanian forces massing at multiple points along the frontier, preparing for what looked like a coordinated offensive that would overwhelm human defenses. But now they had information that could turn the aliens' own strategy against them. The conversion facility was the key to the Corvanian war plan, but it was also their most vulnerable point. If the interconnected energy grid could be disrupted at the right moment, the entire installation would collapse. Sarah stood before the tactical display as intelligence analysts downloaded and processed her camera footage. The images that appeared on the screens showed the full scope of the Corvanian operation. Dozens of converted humans moving with inhuman coordination, massive energy conduits connecting every structure in the complex, and at the center of it all, the twisted spire that seemed to bend space around itself. "My God," whispered Dr. Sarah Kim, the base's chief intelligence analyst. "They're not just converting individual prisoners. They're creating a collective consciousness. Every human they capture becomes part of a single alien mind." Colonel Martinez studied the tactical implications with the cold calculation of a career soldier. "How many of our people are already in there?" "At least 200 that I could see," Sarah replied. "Maybe more in the underground sections. But the important thing is that the system has a critical weakness. The energy grid connecting all the buildings is interdependent. Damage one node significantly, and you get a cascade failure through the entire network." Dr. Kim highlighted sections of the footage that showed the energy flow patterns between structures. "Major Chen is right. This isn't just a military installation. It's essentially one massive machine. But the precision required to target the critical nodes would require someone to fly directly into the heart of the facility. The same kind of low-level flight path that Major Chen just completed," Martinez observed, looking at Sarah with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. Sarah knew what he was thinking. She'd proven that the impossible flight could be made, but doing it again would be even more dangerous. The Corvanians would be expecting another attempt, and they'd have their defenses ready. But as she looked at the images of converted humans on the monitor screens, Sarah felt the same burning determination that had carried her through the Crystal Valleys. Those people had been colonists, farmers and miners and engineers who'd been trying to build new lives on the frontier. They deserved better than being turned into weapons against their own species. "Colonel, I'll need a fully armed A-10 and clearance for a strike mission," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had made her one of the best pilots in the colonial fleet. "Major, you just completed the most dangerous reconnaissance flight in human history. You've done enough." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the same steel that had carried her through the electromagnetic maze of the Crystal Valleys. "Sir, with respect, those are our people in there, and I'm the only pilot who knows the route through the defenses. The mission isn't complete until they're free." Outside the bunker, the last Corvanian interceptors were retreating toward space, their attack having failed to prevent the intelligence from reaching human command. But Sarah knew they'd be back with reinforcements, and time was running out to act on the information she'd gathered. The war was about to change, and Major Sarah Chen intended to be at the center of that change. 3 hours later, Sarah stood in the maintenance hangar beside a fresh A-10 Thunderbolt II that had been modified specifically for her mission. The aircraft bristled with specialized ordnance designed by the base's engineering team, using intelligence gathered from her reconnaissance footage. Instead of standard anti-tank missiles, her wings carried electromagnetic pulse warheads that could disrupt the Corvanian energy grid without harming the converted humans inside the facility. Chief Warrant Officer Jackson, the base's senior armorer, walked her through the weapons loadout with the enthusiasm of an engineer who'd been given a chance to test his wildest theories. "These EMP warheads are based on salvaged Corvanian technology we've reverse-engineered. They should create a cascading overload in their energy systems, but you'll need to hit specific nodes in the right sequence." Dr. Kim approached with a tablet displaying the targeting data they'd extracted from Sarah's camera footage. "We've identified 7 critical junction points in the energy grid. If you can hit them in this order, the cascade failure should shut down the entire conversion process and free the captured humans." Sarah studied the attack plan with the same methodical precision she'd learned from years of combat missions. The target sequence would require her to fly a complex pattern through the most heavily defended airspace in Corvanian territory, hitting precision targets while avoiding the defensive systems they'd surely installed since her last visit. Colonel Martinez joined them, carrying orders that had come directly from Colonial Fleet Command. "Major, you've been given full operational authority for this mission. Every available aircraft in the sector has been positioned to provide cover, but once you enter the Crystal Valleys, you'll be on your own again." "Understood, sir. What's the timeline for the attack?" "Intelligence indicates the Corvanians are accelerating their conversion process after your reconnaissance flight. They know we've discovered their operation, so they're trying to complete it before we can respond. You have maybe 6 hours before the process becomes irreversible." Sarah nodded grimly. 6 hours to plan, execute, and complete the most dangerous precision strike mission in human history. It would have been impossible if she hadn't already proven that the flight could be made. But knowing something was possible, and actually doing it were very different things. As the final preparations continued around her aircraft, Sarah found herself thinking about the converted humans she'd seen in the facility. Their faces had been almost peaceful, showing none of the fear or pain she'd expected to see in prisoners. That somehow made their situation worse, knowing they were trapped inside minds that no longer belonged to them. The mission briefing was interrupted by proximity alarms throughout the base. Colonel Martinez's communication unit crackled to life with reports from the perimeter sensors. "Colonel, we're detecting massive Corvanian fleet movements throughout the sector. It looks like they're preparing for a major offensive." Sarah realized the implications immediately. They're not just trying to complete the conversion process, they're using it as bait. They want us to attack the facility so they can eliminate our response capability when we're committed to the assault. Dr. Kim pulled up strategic displays showing Corvanian fleet positions across the colonial frontier. Major Chen is right. They've positioned heavy cruisers at every major human outpost. If we launch this attack, they'll hit our bases while our defenses are focused on supporting the strike mission. It was a perfect tactical trap. The Corvanians had turned their vulnerability into a weapon, betting that human nature would compel them to attempt a rescue mission regardless of the strategic costs. They were counting on the same determination and refusal to abandon people that had made Sarah volunteer for the reconnaissance mission. But Sarah had grown up in a military family that understood the harsh mathematics of warfare. Sometimes saving lives required accepting losses that seemed unacceptable. Sometimes the greatest act of courage was choosing not to fight. "Colonel, what if we turn their trap against them?" Sarah asked, studying the fleet positions with new understanding. "What do you mean, Major?" "They've positioned their forces based on the assumption that we'll try to rescue the converted humans. But what if we hit a different target entirely? Something they're not defending because they think we don't know about it." Sarah pointed to a section of her reconnaissance footage that showed energy conduits extending beyond the conversion facility into the mountainside. These conduits don't just power the conversion process, they're connected to something bigger, something hidden underground. If we can find the source of their power grid, we might be able to shut down their entire operation in this sector. Dr. Kim enhanced the footage, following the energy streams as they disappeared into the mountain range. "You're right. There's a massive power source somewhere in those mountains, something that's feeding energy to installations we haven't even discovered yet." The tactical picture suddenly became clear. The conversion facility wasn't just a weapon, it was a test site. The Corvanians were perfecting the technology to roll out across all human territories simultaneously. The real target wasn't the facility itself, but the power source that would make galactic conquest possible. Colonel Martinez studied the new intelligence with the calculating expression of a chess master, seeing several moves ahead. "Major, you're talking about flying into completely unknown territory to attack a target we can only guess the location of. The odds would be even worse than your last mission." Sarah looked at the tactical displays showing Corvanian fleets positioned to destroy human civilization, then at the images of converted humans who'd lost their freedom to alien technology. The choice was clear, even if the path forward wasn't. "Sir, the odds have never been good since this war started, but humans don't fight because the odds are good. We fight because it's the right thing to do." She turned toward her modified A-10, its weapons gleaming under the hangar lights like a promise of justice for the converted prisoners. And sometimes the impossible is just another word for something nobody's been crazy enough to try yet. Sarah's A-10 lifted off from forward operating base Phoenix as the first hints of dawn painted the alien sky in shades of purple and gold. Behind her, the entire human fleet in the sector was moving into position for what the Corvanians believed would be a desperate rescue attempt at the conversion facility. Instead, Sarah was flying alone toward a target that existed only as energy signatures on her reconnaissance footage. The flight path she'd plotted would take her deeper into Corvanian territory than any human had ever ventured. Following the energy conduits she'd discovered meant flying through mountain ranges that didn't appear on any human maps, navigating by electromagnetic signatures that could just as easily lead her into a trap as to her target. Her modified A-10 handled differently with the experimental weapons, the additional weight changing the aircraft's balance and response characteristics. But Sarah had spent the last hour before takeoff running simulations with the new loadout, adapting her flying style to accommodate the changes. Humans were nothing if not adaptable. The crystal valleys spread below her like a glittering maze of electromagnetic energy. This time, Sarah knew what to expect from the interference patterns, using her previous experience to plot a course that minimized the impact on her systems. The Corvanians had increased their patrols after her last visit, but they were watching the known routes, not the path she was taking now. 50 kilometers into the flight, Sarah began picking up the energy signatures she was following. The conduits Dr. Kim had identified were more extensive than anyone had imagined, forming a network that stretched throughout the mountain range like the nervous system of some vast organism. Whatever the Corvanians were powering, it was big enough to change the balance of the entire war. Her proximity sensors detected movement ahead. 3 interceptors were rising from a hidden base built into the side of a mountain that looked identical to dozens of others in the range. But these ships were different from the ones she'd encountered before. They moved with mechanical precision, their flight patterns showing none of the individual variation she'd expect from living pilots. Sarah realized she was looking at converted Corvanian pilots, their minds enslaved to the same collective consciousness that had claimed the human prisoners. The aliens were using their own technology on themselves, creating an army of perfectly coordinated soldiers who felt no fear and made no individual mistakes. The converted pilots attacked with inhuman precision, their energy weapons firing in patterns calculated to eliminate every possible escape route. Sarah found herself flying against opponents who anticipated her every move, who coordinated their attacks with the efficiency of a single mind, controlling multiple bodies. But mechanical precision had weaknesses that individual creativity could exploit. Sarah began flying in patterns that defied tactical logic, making decisions that no rational pilot would make. She dove when she should have climbed, turned left when the smart move was turning right, and generally flew like someone who had lost her mind. The converted pilots couldn't adapt to her irrational behavior. Their collective consciousness was designed for optimal tactical responses, not for dealing with humans who refused to behave optimally. One interceptor overshot its firing solution when Sarah made a turn that should have been suicidal, and she used the opportunity to put an EMP warhead into its engines. The remaining interceptors broke off their attack and began transmitting data to the collective consciousness. Sarah realized they were downloading her flight patterns, analyzing her irrational behavior to develop countermeasures. In minutes, they'd be back with tactics designed specifically to defeat her unconventional flying. She needed to find the main power source before the Corvanians could organize a proper defense. Following the energy conduits deeper into the mountains, Sarah began detecting massive electromagnetic signatures that dwarfed anything she'd seen at the conversion facility. Whatever lay ahead was generating enough power to supply a small star. The mountain ahead looked ordinary from the outside, but Sarah's instruments were screaming warnings about the energy levels emanating from within. This was it, the source of Corvanian power in this sector of space. Hidden inside what appeared to be a natural mountain peak was a facility that could change the course of galactic civilization. Sarah armed her remaining EMP warheads as she approached the mountain. She had one chance to get this right because there wouldn't be time for a second attack. The converted pilots would be back soon, and this time, they'd bring everything the Corvanians had. The mountain face ahead suddenly opened like a vast mechanical flower, revealing an installation that stretched deep underground. Energy conduits as thick as city buildings snaked through chambers carved from solid rock, feeding power to machinery that seemed to bend reality around itself. At the center of it all was a structure that hurt to look at directly, its geometry defying normal understanding of space and time. Sarah dove her A-10 into the heart of the installation, weaving between energy conduits while targeting the critical junctions that would bring the entire system down. Her first EMP warhead struck a primary distribution node, sending cascades of feedback through the power grid. The second warhead took out a backup system that tried to compensate for the damage. Alarms began sounding throughout the installation as Corvanian technicians scrambled to prevent a complete system failure. But Sarah was already lining up her final shot. The targeting computer locked onto the central structure that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her last EMP warhead struck the impossible structure dead center, and reality seemed to hiccup around the impact point. The energy grid that had powered Corvanian operations across the sector collapsed in a wave of electromagnetic feedback that raced through every connected system. In the conversion facility, hundreds of kilometers away, the converted humans suddenly stopped moving as the collective consciousness that had enslaved them simply ceased to exist. Across the sector, Corvanian ships lost power as their energy distribution network failed catastrophically. Sarah pulled her A-10 into a desperate climb as the mountain began collapsing around her. The Corvanian installation was tearing itself apart as unstable energies fed back through systems never designed to handle such overloads. She had perhaps seconds to clear the blast radius before the entire mountain range became a crater. Her engines screamed at maximum power as she burst from the collapsing installation into clear sky. Behind her, what had been a mountain peak disappeared in a pillar of energy that reached toward space. The blast wave caught her aircraft and sent it tumbling, but the A-10's rugged construction held together long enough for Sarah to regain control. As she leveled off and began the long flight home, Sarah's radio crackled with reports from across the sector. Corvanian fleets were dead in space, their power systems failed. Human colonies were reporting that captured prisoners were walking out of detention facilities, free from the collective consciousness that had enslaved them. The war wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. Humanity had proven once again that determination and courage could overcome any technological advantage. And sometimes, all it took was one pilot willing to fly lower than anyone thought possible. Colonel Martinez's voice came through her headset as Forward Operating Base Phoenix appeared on the horizon. Reaper 17, you've just changed the course of galactic history. How does it feel to prove the impossible wrong? Sarah looked back at the energy pillar still rising from where the Corvanian installation had been, then forward toward the base where free humans were waiting to welcome her home. Control, it feels like Tuesday. Just another day of proving that humans don't know the meaning of impossible. The A-10 Thunderbolt II that had carried her through 2 impossible missions lined up for landing as the sun set over Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new impossibilities to overcome. But today, humanity had won a victory that would be remembered for generations. And Major Sarah Reaper Chen had proven once again that when the SEALs said something couldn't be done, they just hadn't found the right pilot yet.